I never imagined I'd become the center of drama in my own neighborhood, especially over something as simple as parking my car. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, one of those days where nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least, not at first. The day had been pretty uneventful. I ran some errands, picked up groceries, and headed back home. As I turned into my driveway, I felt that small sense of relief you get when you finally return to your space after being out in the world. My house isn't anything fancy, but it's mine, a cozy little corner of the world where I can relax without worrying too much, or so I thought. Just as I was grabbing my grocery bags from the trunk, I noticed someone walking toward me. At first glance, it was Karen, a neighbor who lived a few houses down. She's one of those people everyone knows, always dressed perfectly, with her hair styled just right, and her designer sunglasses perched on her nose like she's auditioning for a commercial. To be honest, she's the kind of person who makes me feel underdressed, even when I'm wearing clean clothes. Karen stopped near my mailbox, her arms crossed, and looked at my car like it had committed a crime. "Excuse me," she said sharply, pointing at my vehicle. Her tone made me freeze mid-motion. What could possibly be wrong now? Confused, I straightened up and faced her. "Is there a problem?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "You can't park here like that," she replied, her lips pressed into a thin line. I blinked, sure I'd misheard her. "What do you mean? This is my driveway." She gave me a look that suggested I was either lying or incredibly dense. According to HOA guidelines, Section 3.2, vehicles must not obstruct visibility or disrupt aesthetic harmony. She paused dramatically before adding, "Your car is too close to the curb, and frankly, it's unsightly." Unsightly? My car? I stared at her, speechless. Sure, it's not brand new. It's got a few scratches and a dent from when I backed into a pole last winter, but calling it unsightly felt like a stretch. Besides, this was my asterisk property. Who was she to tell me how to use it? "This is ridiculous," I muttered, shaking my head. I didn't want to argue, so I tried to brush her off and carry my groceries inside. But Karen wasn't done yet. "If you don't comply," she warned, her voice dripping with self-righteousness, "I'll have no choice but to report this." Report what? That I parked in my own driveway. The whole thing sounded absurd, almost laughable. But as I looked at her stern expression, I realized she wasn't joking. For a moment, I wondered if I'd somehow stepped into an alternate reality where basic logic no longer applied. How could anyone take rules about driveways so seriously? Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a much bigger headache. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, or so I thought. After Karen's bizarre visit, I tried to shake off the encounter by focusing on unpacking groceries and getting dinner ready for my family. It was hard to concentrate, though. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see Karen lurking nearby, clipboard in hand, ready to pounce with another complaint. By the time evening rolled around, I figured she'd said her piece and moved on. Surely, no one would actually take her threats seriously, right? Wrong. 3 hours later, just as I settled onto the couch to unwind, I noticed flashing lights outside. At first, I assumed they were from a passing ambulance or maybe a fire truck responding to an emergency somewhere else. But then I heard the knock. Firm, official. My stomach dropped. No one knocks like that unless it's important. I opened the door to find 2 police officers standing there, their expressions unreadable. Behind them, arms crossed and wearing a smug smile, stood Karen. She looked like she'd won the lottery. "Ma'am," one officer began, glancing between me and Karen, "we received a call about a parking violation." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. What?" I stammered, blinking rapidly. "You're here because of how I parked my car." Karen stepped forward, practically glowing with self-satisfaction. "Officers, thank you for coming. As I explained on the phone, This individual is blatantly disregarding HOA guidelines. Her vehicle is improperly positioned in her driveway, obstructing visibility and creating a hazard. A hazard. I repeated, incredulous. It's literally sitting in my driveway. How is that a hazard? The second officer held up a piece of paper, a copy of the HOA rules, complete with highlights and notes scrawled in the margins. Clearly, Karen had come prepared. According to these regulations, he said cautiously, there are specific requirements regarding vehicle placement. If your car doesn't meet those standards, it could be considered a violation. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These officers were treating this like an actual crime, not some petty neighborhood squabble, all because of where I parked my car, in my own driveway. Turning to Karen, I felt anger bubbling inside me. You call the police over this, over a stupid rule about driveways. She shrugged, feigning innocence. Rules exist for a reason, dear. If everyone ignored them, our community would fall into chaos. Chaos? Really? This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood safe or functional. It was about control. And Karen loved being in charge. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed. Once I showed proof that the driveway belonged to me, and pointed out that nothing in the HOA handbook explicitly banned parking in it, the officers left, clearly embarrassed by the situation. They apologized profusely, saying they were only responding to a complaint. Karen, meanwhile, lingered on the sidewalk, glaring at me like I'd personally insulted her. As I closed the door, my hands were shaking. The whole ordeal felt surreal, like something out of a bad sitcom. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wouldn't let it go that easily. She thrived on drama, on flexing her power over others. And now, thanks to her little stunt, the entire neighborhood probably knew about it. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed the scene in my mind. What gave Karen the right to dictate how I lived my life? Who made her the arbiter of aesthetic harmony, or whatever nonsense she spouted earlier? More importantly, why did anyone listen to her? But even as frustration simmered inside me, something else began to take shape. Determination. I wasn't going to let Karen intimidate me. Not today, not ever. If she wanted a fight, she was about to get one. The next morning, I woke up with a clear sense of purpose. Karen might have thought she'd won by dragging the police into this nonsense, but she'd underestimated one thing: my stubbornness. If she wanted to play games, fine, but I wasn't going down without a fight. And more importantly, I wasn't going to let her bully me or anyone else in the neighborhood. My first step was simple: research. I dug out the HOA handbook, a thick binder filled with pages of tiny print and complicated language. At first glance, it seemed overwhelming, like trying to decipher a foreign language. But as I flipped through the sections, something became obvious. There was no rule explicitly banning cars from driveways. Sure, there were vague phrases about maintaining aesthetic harmony and ensuring visibility, but nothing concrete enough to justify calling the police over someone's parking job. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to take action, not just for myself, but for everyone who'd ever been harassed by Karen's over-the-top enforcement of these so-called rules. I sat down at my kitchen table and drafted a letter addressed to the HOA board. In it, I outlined the lack of clarity in their guidelines and questioned why such trivial matters were being treated as emergencies. I also pointed out how Karen's behavior, calling the police over a non-issue, wasn't just unreasonable, it was divisive and damaging to the community. Once the letter was ready, I made copies and posted them around the neighborhood, on bulletin boards, mailboxes, and even taped to streetlights. Alongside the letter, I included a note inviting neighbors to join me if they'd also experienced similar issues with Karen. I didn't expect much, honestly. People tend to avoid conflict, especially when it involves someone as intimidating as Karen. But to my surprise, responses started trickling in almost immediately. That evening, as I watered the plants in my front yard, a few neighbors stopped by to talk. Some were hesitant at first, glancing over their shoulders like they were afraid Karen might appear out of nowhere. Others were eager to share their stories. One couple told me they'd gotten a formal warning because their mailbox was too colorful. Another neighbor confessed she'd been scolded for leaving a kiddie pool in her backyard during the summer. Each story added fuel to the fire burning inside me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up against unfairness. Word spread quickly, and soon, a small group of us began meeting regularly. We called ourselves the Brookside Lane Advocates, BLA. Though unofficially, we joked that our real name should be Team Anti-Karen. Our goal was simple: hold the HOA accountable and push back against Karen's reign of terror. At first, our meetings were chaotic. Everyone had opinions, ideas, and frustrations, but slowly we started organizing. We divided tasks, shared resources, and brainstormed ways to expose Karen's tactics. One neighbor, Lisa, suggested we document every interaction with Karen or the HOA. If we can show patterns of harassment, she said, it'll be harder for them to dismiss us. Another neighbor, Mark, offered to help create flyers and social media posts to raise awareness. Even those who weren't comfortable speaking out publicly pitched in however they could, whether it was signing petitions or spreading the word quietly. As the days passed, I noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. People who used to avoid eye contact now waved hello. Conversations lingered longer over fences. There was a newfound sense of solidarity, like we were finally waking up to the fact that we didn't have to accept Karen's version of reality. The tension between us and Karen grew thicker, almost palpable, but instead of fear, I felt something else: hope. For the first time since moving to Brookside Lane, I felt like I was part of a real community, one that was ready to stand together. Of course, Karen wasn't going to go down without a fight. But as far as I was concerned, the battle lines had been drawn. And this time, we weren't backing down. Karen didn't waste any time retaliating. If anything, my letter and the growing support from the neighborhood only fueled her determination to prove she was right. Within days, things escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just me anymore. Karen seemed intent on targeting anyone who dared question her authority. It started with small, petty complaints. Neighbors began receiving official notices in their mailboxes for minor infractions: a flower pot that was too bright, a garden hose left out overnight, or even a child's toy bicycle leaning against a fence. Each notice came stamped with the HOA logo and signed neatly in Karen's handwriting. At first, people tried to brush it off, chalking it up to Karen being Karen. But as the complaints piled up, frustration grew. One afternoon, while I was chatting with Lisa outside her house, we noticed Karen walking briskly down the street, clipboard in hand. She stopped in front of Mrs. Peterson's yard, scrutinizing a row of wind chimes hanging from her porch. Without hesitation, Karen scribbled something onto her clipboard before moving on to the next house. "Doesn't she have anything better to do?" Lisa muttered under her breath, shaking her head. I sighed. Apparently not. As if on cue, Mrs. Peterson emerged from her house, looking flustered. "Did you see that woman? She just wrote me another warning. For the asterisk wind chimes asterisk. Can you believe it?" Lisa rolled her eyes. "She's impossible." But Karen wasn't done yet. Later that week, rumors spread about a family down the block who'd received a formal complaint because their dog barked twice during the day. Twice. Another neighbor got flagged for leaving a welcome mat outside their front door. It supposedly clashed with the approved color palette outlined in the HOA handbook. The absurdity of it all was mind-boggling. The tension reached its peak at the next HOA meeting. Normally, these gatherings were dull affairs, attended by a handful of people who nodded along while Greg, the HOA president, droned on about budgets and landscaping schedules. This time, however, the room was packed. Nearly every household had sent someone, eager to voice their grievances, or at least see what would happen. Karen sat near the front, wearing her trademark smug expression. When Greg opened the floor for comments, hands shot up immediately. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their frustrations. Mr. Alvarez spoke about the constant nitpicking over his backyard shed. Mrs. Rodriguez tearfully recounted how Karen had scolded her teenage son for skateboarding on the sidewalk. Even Mrs. Peterson chimed in, holding up her wind chime warning like it was evidence in a trial. Through it all, Karen remained unfazed. When it was her turn to speak, she stood tall, radiating confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "I understand your concerns, but let's not lose sight of what's important here. Our community thrives on order and consistency. If we start making exceptions for everyone, where does it end?" Her words sparked an immediate reaction. Voices erupted around the room, some shouting accusations, others defending her. Chairs scraped against the floor as tempers flared. For a moment, it felt like chaos might take over completely. That's when Greg intervened, raising his hands for silence. "Enough," he shouted, his calm demeanor cracking under the pressure. "This isn't solving anything. We need to find a way to move forward, together." For a brief second, there was quiet. Eyes darted between Greg, Karen, and the rest of us. The room felt heavy with unspoken emotions. Anger, fear, defiance, and maybe even a glimmer of hope. Whatever happened next, one thing was clear: Brookside Lane would never be the same again. The chaos from the HOA meeting only seemed to embolden Karen further. Instead of backing down, she doubled down on her mission to enforce every rule, or rather, her interpretation of them, with an iron fist. It was as if she saw our resistance, not as a warning sign, but as a challenge to prove she was untouchable. And unfortunately for us, that meant things were about to get worse before they got better. One evening, just as I was finishing dinner with my family, there was another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't the police, it was someone from the city zoning department. Two inspectors stood on my porch, holding clipboards and wearing serious expressions. Behind them, predictably, was Karen, looking smug as ever. "Good evening," one of the inspectors said politely. "We're here to assess your driveway based on a complaint filed regarding potential violations of local ordinances." I stared at them, dumbfounded. My driveway. What could possibly be wrong with my driveway? Karen stepped forward, practically glowing with self-satisfaction. "As I explained when I contacted the city, your driveway appears to encroach slightly beyond the designated property line. Additionally, the slope may pose a safety hazard." Encroachment. Safety hazard. My driveway had been there for years, long before Karen moved into the neighborhood. And no one had ever raised an issue before. Yet here we were, with city officials taking measurements and snapping photos like I'd committed some grave offense. For a moment, I felt paralyzed by frustration. How far was Karen willing to go to prove her point? Calling the police was one thing, but involving the city, that crossed a line. Still, I knew panicking wouldn't help. Taking a deep breath, I asked the inspectors to explain exactly what they were looking for. To their credit, they were professional and thorough, explaining that they were simply following protocol after receiving Karen's complaint. Thankfully, the inspection turned out in my favor. After carefully reviewing the property records and conducting their assessment, the inspectors concluded that my driveway was perfectly within legal boundaries. There was no encroachment, no safety hazard, nothing to justify Karen's accusations. As they packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, one of them gave me an apologetic smile. "Sorry for the inconvenience," he said. "These kinds of complaints happen sometimes, but everything checks out on your end." Karen, however, didn't look pleased. Her face turned bright red as she stammered something about needing to double-check the measurements herself. But the inspectors ignored her, climbing into their truck and driving away without another word. Once they were gone, I turned to Karen, my patience wearing thin. "This has gone too far," I said firmly. "You can't keep dragging people into your personal vendettas. Enough is enough." She glared at me, her voice tight with anger. "You think this is over? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Her words sent a chill down my spine, But I refused to let her intimidate me. If anything, her reaction only strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting our community from someone who thrived on control and fear. Word of the failed inspection spread quickly through the neighborhood, sparking even more outrage against Karen. Parents grew particularly incensed when she tried to push through a new rule banning children from playing in front yards, citing safety concerns. Kids weren't allowed to ride bikes, toss footballs, or even draw with chalk on sidewalks, all activities she deemed disruptive to the neighborhood's harmony. That was the final straw for many families. Parents banded together, organizing protests and circulating petitions demanding change. Even those who had previously stayed silent began speaking out, fed up with Karen's relentless pursuit of perfection at the expense of basic human decency. At the next HOA meeting, tensions boiled over once again. When Greg called the session to order, the room buzzed with energy. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their stories, not just about parking or driveways, but about how Karen's actions had impacted their lives. A mother tearfully recounted how her son cried himself to sleep after being told he couldn't play outside. Another neighbor described feeling like a prisoner in his own home, constantly worried about breaking invisible rules. When it was my turn to speak, I held up the petition we'd gathered, a document signed by nearly every household in Brookside Lane. "This isn't about hating Karen," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "It's about fairness, about living in a place where we feel welcome, not controlled. We deserve better than this." The room erupted in applause, leaving Karen visibly shaken. For the first time since all of this began, I saw cracks in her armor. Maybe, just maybe, we were finally getting somewhere. The HOA meeting that followed felt like a turning point, but it wasn't without its chaos. The room was packed again, this time with even more neighbors showing up, some bringing their kids to silently make a statement about Karen's no playing outside proposal. Tensions ran high, and you could feel the weight of everything that had been building over weeks finally coming to a head. When Greg called the meeting to order, he looked visibly stressed, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something closer to desperation. He tried to steer the conversation toward logistical updates, budgets, landscaping schedules, the kinds of things that usually put people to sleep. But no one was having it. Everyone wanted answers, and they weren't going to settle for vague reassurances or half-hearted apologies. Karen, predictably, took center stage early on. She stood up, clutching her clipboard like it was a lifeline, and launched into what I can only describe as a monologue. "This neighborhood is special," she began, her voice dripping with self-importance. "We have standards that ensure Brookside Lane remains a model community. Without them, we risk losing everything we've worked so hard to build." Her words hung in the air for a moment before being met with a chorus of groans and muttered objections. Someone shouted from the back, "Standards or dictatorship?" Karen ignored the comment, pressing on as though she hadn't heard. "Change is inevitable, yes, but not at the expense of our values. Compromise undermines excellence." That's when I stepped forward, unable to stay quiet any longer. "Compromise isn't undermining anything," I said firmly, my voice cutting through the murmurs in the room. "It's about finding balance, about listening to each other instead of dictating rules that don't make sense to anyone but you." Karen's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, I thought she might actually lunge at me. Instead, she turned to Greg, clearly expecting him to intervene on her behalf. But Greg didn't say a word. His silence spoke volumes. He knew which way the wind was blowing. One by one, neighbors chimed in, sharing examples of how Karen's obsession with control had affected them. A young couple talked about how they'd received multiple warnings for painting their front door a shade of blue that wasn't approved, even though it matched every other house on the block. Another neighbor recounted how Karen had demanded they remove a bird feeder because it attracted squirrels, which she claimed were a nuisance. Each story added fuel to the growing fire of frustration. As the meeting dragged on, Greg finally stepped in, raising his hands for quiet. "Look," he said, his tone weary but firm, "we need to address these concerns constructively. Finger-pointing isn't helping anyone. Let's focus on solutions." But the damage had already been done. When the floor opened for a vote on whether Karen should remain head of the HOA committee, the decision was unanimous. She was out. Some of her supporters tried to defend her, arguing that she had the neighborhood's best interests at heart, but their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming majority who'd had enough. Karen didn't take the news well. Her face flushed red, and for once, she seemed speechless. She stormed out of the meeting without another word, leaving behind an almost palpable sense of relief in the room. People hugged, laughed, and even cried. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted from Brookside Lane. In the days that followed, life slowly started returning to normal, or at least a new version of normal. Without Karen breathing down everyone's necks, the neighborhood began to breathe easier. Kids played outside again, parents chatted over fences, and gardens bloomed with colors that didn't strictly adhere to the old guidelines. Still, the scars remained. Trust took time to rebuild, and not everyone forgave Karen easily. Some neighbors avoided her altogether, while others exchanged polite but distant greetings when they crossed paths. Rumors swirled that she'd listed her house for sale, though no one could confirm it for sure. For me, the experience left a lasting impression. It taught me the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it feels daunting, and the power of community when people come together. Brookside Lane wasn't perfect, and maybe it never would be, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like home. In the weeks that followed Karen's removal from the HOA committee, Brookside Lane began to transform, not overnight, but gradually, like the first signs of spring after a long winter. The neighborhood felt lighter somehow, as though a heavy curtain had been lifted. People smiled more, waved hello, and lingered longer during conversations. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements here and there. But for the first time in ages, it felt like we were all on the same side. Karen kept mostly to herself after the fallout. She stopped patrolling the streets with her clipboard and avoided community events altogether. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of her peeking out from behind her curtains, watching as kids played soccer in the cul-de-sac or families hosted barbecues in their driveways. Whether she was sulking or plotting her next move, no one could say for sure. But eventually, rumors started swirling that she put her house on the market. One morning, a for sale sign appeared in her front yard, confirming what many of us had suspected: Karen was moving out. The news spread quickly, and while some neighbors felt a pang of guilt about celebrating her departure, most couldn't help but feel relieved. At the same time, there was an unspoken understanding that her behavior hadn't existed in a vacuum. The rigid rules and micromanaging culture of the HOA had given her the platform to exert control. And now, it was up to us to make sure nothing like that happened again. Greg, the HOA president, seemed genuinely shaken by the whole ordeal. He called another meeting to discuss reforms, this time inviting input from everyone. For once, the atmosphere was collaborative rather than combative. We talked openly about simplifying the rules, focusing on practicality instead of perfection, and creating a system where complaints could be addressed fairly without turning into personal vendettas. By the end of the session, we'd drafted a new set of guidelines, one that prioritized kindness and flexibility over nitpicking and fear. As the months passed, Brookside Lane settled into a rhythm that felt authentic and sustainable. Families decorated their porches for holidays without worrying about color palettes. Kids rode bikes down the street, laughing loudly enough to echo through the trees. Even the wind chimes Mrs. Peterson loved so much jingled freely in the breeze, adding music to our days. Of course, not everything healed immediately. Some relationships remained strained, especially among those who had supported Karen early on. Trust takes time to rebuild, and forgiveness doesn't come easily when wounds run deep. But slowly, incrementally, bridges were mended. Conversations became less guarded, smiles less forced. Neighbors who had once avoided each other found common ground over shared struggles and victories. For me personally, the experience changed how I viewed my role in the community. Before all this, I'd see myself as just another face in the crowd, someone who paid dues and followed the rules without making waves. Now, I realized that staying silent only gave people like Karen more power. Speaking up, even when it's scary, it's how change happens. And sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about creating space for others to live freely too. Eventually, the for sale sign disappeared from Karen's yard, replaced by a shiny new lockbox hanging on the front door. A moving truck arrived one Saturday morning, and within hours, her furniture was gone, her house empty. No dramatic goodbye, no parting words, just silence. Some neighbors speculated she'd moved to a gated community where her need for order might actually be appreciated. Others joked that she'd probably taken over as head of the HOA there within a week. Either way, it didn't matter. Her chapter in Brookside Lane was closed. Now, whenever I pull into my driveway, or park however I please, I smile. Not because it's rebellious or defiant, but because it's mine. My home, my space, my choice. And while the scars of the past will always linger in small ways, they remind me of something important. That communities aren't defined by their rules or regulations, but by the people who live in them. Together, we're stronger than any one person's need for control. Brookside Lane isn't perfect, it never will be. But it's ours. And that makes all the difference.